Well, your archive is going into whatever university you have in mind for your, because it's amazing stuff. You really have you. I don't know who else has been able to do anything like what you've done. So it's really great.
Thank you.
The Jinx is a six-part HBO documentary series. It details the case of real estate heir Robert Durst.
The director promises tonight's final installment will answer questions people have been asking for decades.
As The Jinx aired, Bob and I spoke after every episode. He was very nervous, and I thought to myself, he's gonna run.
My captain told me, whatever you do, don't let Robert Durst get away.
Bob was going to flee the country, never to return. And of course, that didn't happen.
Hello, this is a prepaid call from Bob.
Bob? Steve, I was arrested this afternoon. Oh, boy. Yep.
When Bob has a friend, he expects blind loyalty.
Bob, you were a good friend. I only have the fondest, greatest memories of you.
You should expect to get a call from the DA wanting to talk to you, but you don't tell them shit.
Turns out, when you have a whole lot of money, people are willing to do things for you because they think some of that money might go their way.
I'm the baddest man alive. Everybody's gonna work together to get me out of here.
You don't kill 3 people over 30 years and get away with it in a vacuum.
What do you do when your best friend kills your other best friend?
I'll tell you something, Bob. What you need to do is stay out of it.
This is my
life. Just listen.
You were lying because you did remember.
I lied to you.
If a good friend of mine is implicated in 3 murders, I'd like to think I would recoil from that. But who knows until you're tested.
I am getting my own 15 minutes, and it is gargantuan.
Hi, this is Chuck Braverman. It's another episode of Westdoc Online. And before we begin, I want to remind you we're brought to you in part by Real Screen Summit. Go to our website at westdoconline.com or westdoc.net and scroll down to the bottom. There's a Real Screen icon there. Click on it, and you'll find out all about the latest events, which is usually a Real Screen Summit, which is a terrific event to attend, which I've been doing for 20 years. Today, we have an exceptional episode with an exceptional filmmaker, Andrew Jarecki, whose current new part 2 of the Jinx 6-part episodes on HBO Max is just rolling out an episode at a time. Let's say hi to Andrew. Hi, Andrew. How are you?
I'm good. Hi, Chuck.
Hi. I don't know if you remember, but I was thinking back, as soon as I booked this show, when we first met was when you had just finished capturing the Friedmans. And I don't remember, I hadn't started teaching at Brooks yet, but I had some relationship up there with somebody. And I invited you to bring your new film that nobody had heard of, nobody knew anything about because it hadn't been released. And we went into this very nice screening room with maybe 150 people, something like that. And they had this nice digital projector, and on comes on the big screen capturing the Friedmans. And and it was a full house, and people were stunned, because I think nobody knew what to expect. And it was such a great film. And if you had just quit right then, the filmmaking, you would have gone down in history as a fabulous filmmaker, I think, right? And how are your feelings about capturing the Friedmans these days? How many, 10, 20 years later almost, right?
I remember that very well. I absolutely remember. I mean, of course, it was like my first full-length film, and I remember the people that are nice to you on the very first outing are people that you don't forget. So every time I got an email from you or you talk about who's in the series or whatever, I'm always jumping in, and I always have a smile on my face. And I remember that screening, just, being in that situation where people were discovering the film for the first time. And it was such an emotional film for me and for the audience. And I had gotten so invested in the story that it was just very powerful to see it in a room with people that care about film, in a room with people that care about human beings. It was, you don't always get that. And it was really a very, very good experience.
Let's just make a transition for a second. Talk about your background, which I know a bit about, but I could just read off the notes I have, but I think it might be more compelling to hear you tell me a little bit about how did you get into film? Because I don't think you went to film school, did you? You were...
No, I actually was. I grew up in New York. I was always interested in theater and film, and my family was in business. My father is not an artist in any way. My mother is. My mother was a writer at Time Magazine and was actually the film critic when they didn't always tell you who the film critic was. But she worked with a guy named Brad Dara, who was at the time, like the Time film critic, who was like the most important film critic. And my mom was the person that would write a lot of the reviews independently. My mother went to see 8½, at the time of its release. And my mother wrote the Time magazine review of 8½, which she panned, and which maybe is one of the reasons why she got out of the film criticism business. But I know that I always had that dichotomy living in my head. My dad was a very, if he ever wanted to be in the film business, he would have been a producer. He's a very German, well-organized, keeps the trains running on time kind of person. My mother is much more open and much freer emotionally, and just a person, who's much more likely to connect with writing and with film and with art. And so over time, I just probably did some of each, and eventually, when I went to Princeton, and they had a very good theater department, and I started directing plays there, and I felt that was very comfortable for me. And then when I graduated, I made a short film with a filmmaker named Dan Allgrant, who's gone on to do really interesting film work, but I was sort of part of his first meaningful outing, and he and I made this film together in a way that was really, really fun. And it got into Sundance, and so suddenly I was sort of like, well, I don't know, we made this thing and people seem to like it. Maybe I should do more of this. And then around that time, I had a business idea sort of related to the movie business, which was I was trying to go to the movies one night and I couldn't get through to my local theater. And by the time I got through, it was, 8:30. And I had been getting busy signals for 20 minutes. And, you remember when you used to call the local theater and it was always busy. And so the machine told me that the movie started at 8:10 or something. And if I had gotten through on the first try, I would have been able to see the movie. But in fact, I didn't get to see the movie, so I had a couple hours to kill. And I thought, how is it possible that this mighty Hollywood can't figure out how to get my measly $7 out of my pocket for whatever silly movie I was going to see? And so I started scribbling notes on a blue pad, and I thought, well, you ought to be able to use a computer to give people movie show times. So I had this idea for what eventually became Movie Phone.
Hello, and welcome to Movie Phone, brought to you by the New York Times and Hot 97.
And then I did that for 11 years. That became a huge part of my life, and it was incredibly fun and interesting. And we ended up, not just having a handful of people use it, but by the time we had the company had evolved, we were serving 5 million moviegoers a week, which was around 20% of all U.S. moviegoers. We're using this telephone service and using our service on the internet, and so that was extremely fun. We ended up selling the company to AOL in 1999, and I went right back into filmmaking. Almost immediately, I started working on a film that I thought was going to be a very bite-sized, simple, let me make a documentary and get my feet wet again. And so I started making a film that I thought was going to be about this little community of children's birthday party entertainers in New York City. We're kind of a quirky group that were all friends and they all knew each other and kind of lived among children. And I thought, I ought to find an interesting story in here. I don't know exactly what it's going to be. And then, of course, I discovered that my main character, or one of my main characters, had a secret story. And that was just really just pulled me in with a tornado-like power. And I ended up, sinking into that. And that was just a massive life experience to get into that. And was able to make a film about it and collaborated with a very brilliant Richard Henkin, who I have to say is still a key collaborator of mine, and just worked on the Jinx and worked on the first Jinx and worked on just about everything I ever did. So it was a hugely, it was a very seminal experience for me.
When, and I assume at some point HBO and Sheila Nevins got involved, and was that near the end or in the middle, or how involved were they in helping to finish off this film?
Well, we took Capturing the Friedmans to Sundance, and we won the grand jury prize at Sundance, and that was in 2003. And Sheila would not see the movie, and everybody said to me, like, "Well, you got to get Sheila to see the movie because this movie should end up on HBO." And I said, "Well, I'm all in favor of that." And I said, plus Sheila's so brilliant, and I'd love to show her the movie. And there was a lot of this like hocus pocus in the early. Well, she's not going to come and see the screening. She doesn't do that. And I said, well, that's how you should see this movie, is in a room with 500 people. And they said, oh, she's too busy. And there was a lot of plotting. Like Sheila's just, she's a master chess player, and she knew that this was a movie that people were interested in. So they said, well, you got to give her a VHS tape of it. And I said, well, I'm not doing that. And they said, but this is Sheila Nevins, and this is your first film. You're an idiot. And I said, well, it might be my first film, but I know that she's going to like this movie, but she's got to see it on a big screen and uninterrupted. And I don't want her sitting there like eating potato chips and getting a phone call. And so I didn't show it to her. And then eventually she got back to New York, and I got a couple phone calls from people at HBO saying like, well, I mean, now that we're back in New York, I think she really should see it. And again, I just said, that's fine, but she has to see it in the theater. And finally, somebody said to me, like, you have to like bridge the gap here, because she's very proud and she's got her way of doing things and she doesn't want to get pushed around. And I said, okay, I'm in New York, she's in New York. I will bring it up with me to her office, and we will watch it in the HBO screening room together. And somebody said, well, don't you think that's going to be weird? And I was like, no, she's going to love me. I'm going to love her. It's going to be fine. And so we sat together in that big HBO screening room when it was at Bryant Park, and watched the film together. It's a very emotional experience. She was moved. I was moved that she was moved. And we kind of bonded over it. And she said, all right, well, we ought to try to do this together.
Wow, that's a pretty interesting story. I had no idea. That's why I asked, I guess.
Yeah.
And but her now, Lisa and is it Nancy?
Nancy Abraham and Lisa Heller, and now Sarah Rodriguez, who's kind of the next generation as well.
And how did, it's funny in a way. After I got into, I made the mistake, the way they have it laid out on HBO Max. It says up at the top, The Jinx Part 2, and you start episode 1. And I started watching it, and I thought, this looks very familiar. And of course, it was the original. But I got sucked in again, and I had seen it, the whole thing, when it came out. But now, how many years has it been? 12 years. So I watched all 4 or 6, how many episodes? 6 episodes of the first Part 1.
Yeah.
And now I felt
8 years, only 8 years.
I felt like I had knew everything about it, except I knew that there were this Part 2. And so now, as we sit here today, I think I haven't seen the last 2 episodes. I think I saw the first, how many? There's 6 of Part 2. Is that right? Yeah, so right.
There's 6. Both seasons are 6 parts. It's 6 parts 1, 6 parts 2.
And I was thinking, geez, you must feel like you've spent your whole life hanging around Robert Durst. How did you get back? I mean, once you had finished it off, you must have been somewhat relieved, and then the proverbial you-know-what hit the fan as the show came out and so on and so forth. Didn't you want to kind of walk away from it, or did you walk away, and how did you get drawn back in, kind of like Godfather 2 or 3 or whatever it is, right?
I mean, I had made this film called All Good Things, which was sort of my follow-up to Capturing the Friedmans. The next thing I made was a narrative feature film about Robert Durst.
Hi.
Forgotten why I'm here. Ambassador, you remember my eldest son, David?
David, the heir apparent, of course.
And our Greg Kinnear. Greg is a extremely funny, and Greg just did. There was a roast for my 60th birthday, and Greg was roasting me, and he said, Andrew, he's always doing something interesting. He's always working on something different. Sometimes it's a feature film about Robert Durst, or a podcast about Robert Durst, or a 6-part miniseries about Robert Durst, or and it's a little true. There's no question about it. But after Capturing the Friedmans, I had gotten interested in the Durst story, and my partner Mark and I had started writing a screenplay about the story of Bob Durst and his first wife, Kathy, who disappears. And it's really kind of a love story, and it goes bad. But I was very engrossed in that story always. And so we made that film, and Robert Durst is played by Ryan Gosling, and Kirsten Dunst plays his wife, and Frank Langella plays his father, and the great Philip Baker Hall plays the neighbor in Galveston who ends up getting murdered and dismembered. Anyway, it's a very intense. Lily Rabe is in that, who's superb. Anyway, so that was an amazing experience to make that film, and I was excited to see it come out. And we had reached out to Bob Durst during the course of making All Good Things, that film, because we wanted to get his opinion. We wanted him to help us talk about the screenplay, but we knew it was a little bit dicey because he had been accused of murdering his wife and never convicted for it. And so his lawyer said to us, well, Bob is he's a private guy and he wishes you well, but he doesn't need to be a part of it. And so he's not going to participate. So we sort of agreed, and we got in touch with him one or two more times, and they maintained their view that they didn't want to participate. So now the film is getting ready to come out in theaters, and it's and there's a big article in the New York Times about the verisimilitude of the film, that we had recreated a whole section of Times Square, that we had really paid attention to the detail, that we had done this exhaustive amount of sort of documentary-style research into Bob Durst's life story. And Bob reads this article in the Times, and he decides he's going to call me. And so you also know Eamon Bowles. Eamon is the head of Magnolia Pictures, and Eamon was the distributor. And so Eamon and I were talking all the time around the time that All Good Things was coming out, around 2010. And when I would talk to him, we would always joke around and we would use Bob Durst's voice. So Bob has a very memorable kind of distinctive voice. And so, for example, when we would hang up the phone, one of us could say to the other one, bye-bye. And that was sort of the way Bob finishes phone calls. So one day, Eamon is sitting in his office. We're probably, 2 weeks from the film coming out. And he gets, his secretary comes in. She says, oh, Bob Durst is on the phone. And so he picks up the phone thinking it's me. And he says, hey, Bob, how you doing? I'm not surprised you're calling. I think we did a hell of a job with the film. And there's a long pause. And the person on the other end of the phone says, who am I talking to? And Eamon says, oh, who is this? And he says, this is Robert Durst. And Eamon was very surprised by this. And he says, well, how can I help you? I want to talk to Andrew Jarecki. All right, well, he's not here, but I can give him your number. So I get Bob Durst's number from Eamon, and I know that I'm going to call Bob, And so I'm able to start recording the first phone call I ever had with him because I kind of knew that he wanted to talk to me. I certainly wanted to talk to him. And so he wanted to see the film. Do you want me to tell you the rest of this story? Tell me if I'm overdoing it.
Yeah, absolutely. This is fascinating. This is the kind of stuff you won't find on Wikipedia.
Yeah. So I call Bob, and he says, "Well, I have an idea, and I don't know if it's a good idea, but you're the one to talk to about it." And he starts explaining to me that lots of people have tried to interview him over the years, and different television networks to get his side of the story of all these 3 murders, and he's been misunderstood, and he feels like he wants to have something out there from him, sort of his version of the story. And, maybe I'm somebody that would be interested in talking to him about it. Also, he knew that the film was going to come out. He very much wanted to see it. And so I said, well, I'm happy to show it to you. Why don't we meet up? So he was in L.A., and I go to Los Angeles. I meet him at the Peninsula Hotel in that Belvedere restaurant. It was kind of a very strange experience because he's such a charming fellow, certainly at that time. He gets a little bit more ghoulish later in his life. But at that time, he was, wearing a beautiful cashmere sweater, and his hair is like perfectly done, and he's handsome. And so I meet him. I shake hands with him. It's very strange because he feels very familiar to me. I grew up in New York. I grew up in a wealthy family in New York. He did the same. He went to nice universities around town. He went out to fancy restaurants. He went to Xenon when he was a kid, younger man. I did the same thing. So it felt like somebody that I already knew. And we had a very nice interaction. But while I'm shaking hands with him, I have to be thinking to myself, this soft hand of a man who has never done a stitch of hard labor in his life was the hand that he used to take a bow saw and dismember Morris Black. And when he was done with that, he took an axe and he chopped through Morris Black's body. So it was that strange tension. And by the way, I just had a huge fight with Harvey Weinstein because Harvey had run out of money. And Harvey was the distributor of the Jinx. And Harvey had said to me, this was right before the King's Speech came out and kind of saved Harvey and Bob for a little while financially. And Harvey said, I can't afford to release your movie. I know I said I would, but I can't do it. And Harvey and I had this like terrible giant fight. And eventually I took the movie back and Eamon distributed it and did a great job. But in the meantime, when you're sitting in the Peninsula Hotel, it's that thing, when you have like a glass of water and it's like in Jurassic Park when the dinosaur comes and it goes and the surface of the water just like quivers a little bit. That's what happened, I think, with my orange juice. And I thought, I bet Harvey's here. And I turn around and Harvey's walking through, trundling through the way that he used to through that peninsula like he owns the place. And here's Bob Durst. Harvey knows everything about Bob because Harvey was for a time the distributor of the film. And so Harvey walks by and he sees me and kind of grumbles, hi, Andrew. And I said, oh, Harvey, let me introduce you to somebody. So I bring Harvey over and he shakes hands with Bob. He doesn't know who it is in the beginning. I said, Harvey, this is Bob Durst. And Harvey's like mid-handshake. You could just tell he just recoils, like he doesn't know what to think. And then Bob and I agreed that he's going to see the movie. I arranged for him to see it in Santa Monica. There was that little screening room not too far from the water. And I had arranged for him to see the movie at like 3:00. And I decided I wasn't going to go see the movie with him because it's a pretty personal experience for him. And I thought, well, let me just let him see it on his own. And I said, well, call me after. And he said, okay, but just to let you know, I'll probably need a few days to absorb it. I don't think I'll call you right after. I said, well, that's fine. So the movie ends at like, 4:55 or something. And at 4:57, my phone rings and it's Bob. And he says, I want you to know I like the movie very much. Kirsten Dunst was just like my wife, Kathy. I cried 3 times. You know Robert Durst. And he said, well, let's talk about doing something together. And then that's what led to us doing these 3 days worth of interviews, which ended up sort of being the centerpiece of the Jinx.
And after the original Jinx streamed on HBO, and then suddenly people became interested in Robert Durst again and his missing wife, and now that everything is exploding and the cops are after him and so on and so forth. Well, what was your relationship post part one with him?
Well, I had made a decision. There were lots of stages, but let's say that once we knew we had this evidence, we had this letter that matched something called the cadaver note, which had been sent to the police by the killer. And Bob had admitted to me in the interview that cadaver note, that had to have been written by the killer. And so once we had another document that Bob had written that was a perfect match for the cadaver note that Bob had admitted had to have been written by the killer, we now had Bob in a it was probably going to be very hard for him to get out of that. So we thought that he would be prosecuted ultimately. And so the next piece, the missing piece, was to show that evidence to Bob, because at the time I had hired Marcia Clark to advise me on this, because
this is all after the part one.
No, it was mid part one, before it had come out. So Marcia, who has a lot of experience, obviously, with the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office and so on, I said to her, listen, we have this evidence, and we think it's determinative. We think that it's going to prove that Bob killed Susan Berman, and if he killed Susan Berman, then he definitely killed his wife, because it was part of a witness killing, and what was she a witness to, if not the disappearance of the wife? And so we said, we think that this will, essentially prove him guilty of 3 murders. And she said, I don't disagree with you, but it's not enough. And I said, well, how is it not enough? And she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to show it to him, but I got to figure out the timing, because I don't want to be sitting on evidence and not showing it to the police. And she said, trust me, the police are not going to arrest Bob Durst if you hand them a confession. And at that time, we didn't have a confession, but we had this incredibly damning piece of evidence. And she said, your instinct is you want to sit down and show it to him, right? Do it, because the LAPD is never going to be able to do that. You can do it before you go to the police. You can show it to him and get his reaction on film. It's going to be priceless for the prosecution. He's going to be very surprised by it. He will have forgotten that this other letter ever existed, that it was sitting in Susan Berman's personal effects and ultimately wound up in her sort of adoptive son Sarab's storage area. And so we agreed that we were going to show Bob the evidence. We do this interview, and I show him the material, and then he sees for the first time that there is a piece of evidence that is going to tie him to the cadaver note, which means that he killed Susan Berman. And then I said, now I want to ask you about the cadaver note, the famous cadaver note. I show him the cadaver note. He can see now for the first time that they're identical. And that's when he starts getting uncomfortable and burping and rubbing his face and having all these kinds of tells. And eventually I say to him, so you wrote one of these, but you didn't write the other one. Yes, I wrote the one to Susan Berman, but I did not write the cadaver one. And so I show him on a piece of paper, I had isolated just the address each of them. And I said, well, so you wrote one of these, but you didn't write the other one. Can you tell me which one you didn't write? And he can't answer. I had had a lot of conversation about how I wanted to handle the rest of that interview. And I thought, I think I've got to buy his explanation in the moment. If I do what some of my team were saying, oh, you got to make this the big moment. You got to say to him, Bob, you lost me. I was with you there. I was trying to give you the benefit of the doubt, but now I know for sure you're guilty. He's going to run. Right now, he's going to think, now I got a filmmaker who's on the rampage who's going to go and bring this to law enforcement. So I had to play it like it wasn't that big a deal. And so when he gives me his kind of flimsy explanation, well, block letters are block letters. They look similar, but they're not really similar. I had to sort of say, oh, okay, I understand. Yeah, I see what you're saying. And I said to Zach, he's going to call me tomorrow. If I do this right and we keep it at a low boil, he's going to call me tomorrow to feel me out and see what I think of yesterday's interview. Because if I say to him, oh my God, Bob, I mean, I've been up all night now that I know for sure that you're guilty, then he knows he's got to go to Cuba. But if I said to him like, oh yeah, so he does call me the next day. And it was one of those phone calls that's like, I don't remember exactly what he asked me, but it was like 3 items in a series, The first question is like, what was that delicious tea they served at the Regency? Oh, I've got to get some of that from my apartment. And then the second question was something else. And then I knew the third question was coming like, remember I told you the thing about the block letters? And again, I had a very, very low-key response. I said, oh, I understand what you were saying. Yeah, different than, cursive handwriting. Block letters, they are very similar. And I think I made him calm. And I think that he didn't know whether we thought it was a big deal or not. And so things kind of went back to sleep. And now that you've seen the episodes, you can see that they say, why are you still here? Why aren't you in Cuba? And he says, no, I guess I guess inertia. I didn't really think that I was going to be arrested. And I think that that's sort of what was going on in his mind for a whole long period of time, right? Because I did that interview with him in 2012. He doesn't get arrested until 2015. But right after that interview, he gets up and he goes to the bathroom. And that's when he kind of emits all this information. He goes in the bathroom. The first thing he says when he goes in the door is, there it is, you're caught. So it was on his mind.
Did you ever feel like maybe he wanted to be caught and wanted the attention?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have a book. Where's my Theodore Reich book? Maybe it's upstairs. There's a great book by the psychiatrist Theodore Reich called The Compulsion to Confess. And it is that kind of telltale heart phenomenon that somebody who has done something awful, even if they're sort of sociopath, even if they don't necessarily censure themselves in their own behavior, Bob Durst knew that he had killed the woman who loved him more than anyone ever loved him in his life. And that, I think that stayed with him. I think that always bothered him, And we used to say, Bob might have killed his wife. He might have killed his best friend, Susan Berman. He might have killed his neighbor in Galveston. But he was still a guy who lost his best friend, lost his wife, lost his neighbor. He saw himself in a lot of ways as an unfortunate soul. And so
the unluckiest man in the world.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought he would, I knew that he was driven to tell somebody. And by the way, it wasn't just the telltale heart, beating. It wasn't just that he felt guilty. It's also that he wanted credit. Because, if you look at Bob's life, he has the same problem a lot of rich kids have, right? I've got a book here called The Legacy of Inherited Wealth, which is a fascinating story. It's sort of a researched piece about how people who grew up in wealthy families, people who are given a lot of money at an early age, people who are heirs, have a tremendous amount of trouble in life because they can't distinguish themselves. They can't prove that they're good too. If their dad was the biggest oil man in the history of Texas, what are they going to do? They're going to become the Hunt brothers and they're going to blow all their money on a bunch of speculation. Like, there's just a long history of wealthy people, having kids who become adrift. And I think Bob was one of those kids. He was sort of raised by governesses. His mother died at an early age. His father was a workaholic. His father was not very engaged with his kids. And so, Bob was always somebody who had trouble distinguishing himself. And then as life goes on, he's passed over for the leadership of his family company because he's, got a few problems, like his history of having killed his wife and most people believing that. So he had a lot of reasons why they couldn't choose him. But he's passed over in favor of his younger brother, which is a huge humiliation that Bob doesn't get to run the Durst organization. And he hates his brother and hates his family so much, and I think is just driven to try to distinguish himself in some way, and knew, what's that Oscar Wilde says, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. I think Bob really believed that he was good at something that nobody else in his family was good at. He had done something that almost nobody you can imagine had done, which is to kill 3 people and get away with it and protect yourself and defend yourself from people that are trying to interfere with your liberty or something like that. So to some extent, I think he wanted credit for it. He wanted people to see, in a way, what he had done.
Were you ever concerned about your safety?
I mean, I was never afraid of Bob when I was with him or when I was talking to him or when I was pursuing the second interview. I was never concerned about that. But after, in the 4th episode of The Jinx, there is a moment where I'm sort of disloyal to Bob, which is at a point when we take a break in the interview and I say, let's get a drink of water or something like that. And I'm legitimately just ready to take a break because that interview was going on for hours and hours and hours. And Bob stays on camera, stays in his seat, and he starts rehearsing his next answer. And he says, if you remember, he says to himself, I did not knowingly, intentionally lie. I made mistakes, but I did not knowingly lie. I did not knowingly, intentionally lie. So he's sort of testing out different answers he's going to give. And his lawyer comes in and says, you're still on camera. And you don't, and he says, oh, yeah, okay. Well, all I was saying was that, whatever. When episode 4 comes out and they see that we've included that, now the writing is on the wall that we're not afraid to show Bob in a negative light. And I think he started to get very nervous at that time, and he had been watching the show. He also knew that we weren't showing him the episodes, that they had asked, well, can we see them before they come out? And I said, oh, well, HBO, it's all very complicated. And so ultimately we didn't show him the episodes because we thought he was going to run. And so finally, when episode 5 emerges, we know that he's going to be very nervous because that's where we show the 2 documents and sort of confront him with that, or we show us discovering the 2 documents. And so now I know he's upset. And I hear from a friend of his, we hear from a friend of his, Bob he's in, what do they say? He's in the wind. In other words, Bob he's gone, he's left Houston, and he's on his way somewhere. We learn in the second part of the Jinx that he was on his way to Cuba, and he's driving through New Orleans to get there. And and now he's very upset. And they say he's very angry at Andrew. And at that point, I thought it was uncomfortable. And I actually asked our friend Gavin DeBecker, who sort of put together a security detail for me, and I had some people with me. And I remember at that time, my daughter was around 9 years old, and she said, we were sitting at dinner, and I just said to her kind of nonchalantly, I said, oh, by the way, Jeremy, tomorrow when I take you to school, we're going to have another person with us. And she immediately started crying. So I knew that she knew that there was potentially a problem just from, the way kids pick up stuff in the house. And then the last thing that happened around that was I remembered that the first time I'd interviewed Bob, which I'd done at the that Lowe's Santa Monica hotel in a conference room, I was standing in the the entrance to that hotel has that big kind of turning circle, and I was standing out there waiting for Bob to show up, and I thought to myself, I wonder what kind of car Bob Durst drives. Like, if you're a triple homicide suspect and you're trying to keep a low profile in Los Angeles, like what do you drive? And he shows up in a canary yellow smart car. And I just thought, well, this tells me a lot about Bob Durst.
I like to ask filmmakers a little bit about the nuts and bolts about the actual filmmaking, and I think the storytelling certainly is a triumph, and there's another triumph here which we don't really hear enough about as recreations, and I think you've integrated the recreations in such a clever way so many times in there.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think, we've tried to do some very original things in the way that we do recreations. First and foremost, I think as a documentarian, it's very important that the recreations never appear to be something we're selling as if it's reality, right? It has to be an amplification of reality, and it has to feel different enough that the audience never feels like we're trying to pretend it's something it's not. So, for example, we always shoot everything in 48 or 60 frames. All the recreations happen either in slow motion or super slow motion. So when you're watching, it changes your perspective. You don't think, oh, well, this is just a continuation of the prior scene.
How many days of shooting recreations do you think you had roughly? And how many locations? And were they studios or courtrooms or both or what?
I mean, we recreate the entire courtroom, the entire Los Angeles courtroom, down to the plastic COVID screens and down to what was on the back of the chair that said court reporter, and half of the lettering is fallen off. And, we try to get every nuance of it. We need the right stenography machine.
In a soundstage, you mean, or what?
We did that in a soundstage, yeah. So we shot that stuff in Brooklyn. At a place called Eastern Stages, and it was a very big set, right? It was a real full-size courtroom that was essentially scale of the same courtroom that they had in Los Angeles. I mean, I think we shot somewhere around a month of recreations, and some of it was on a soundstage, some of it was on locations. Some of it was in a boat in, Florida, heading toward Cuba. We tried to get it as perfect as we could.
And what was the editing schedule roughly?
I mean, we've been cutting material since for about 5 years, and I would say that's very typical for me. I always I bring on an editor almost immediately when I start working on a film, and it could, I guess it could be seen as wasteful, and sometimes the editors think I'm crazy. Like the editors will say, "Yeah, I've heard this a million times. You brought me on too early," and
I've never heard an editor say that.
No, they do. I mean, they don't say if it's somebody that's, if they don't get a lot of work, then they're happy to have the job. But the people that we've been able to work with are so good that sometimes when they go through the frustrating process of having to grind through material hundreds of times to get it right, which, as you know, is like such a huge part of the process, editors get frustrated, and they will sometimes say, "You brought me on too early."
I usually ask the filmmakers to give me an idea of what the budget is for a project, and I know this is a 6-part project, but you get us in the zip code of the kind of money you had to spend. I mean, you can guess it's not cheap if you spent 4 to 6 weeks recreating in sound stages and so on and so forth. But
yeah, I mean, I don't think they like us to say how much we spent on it, but I would say, this was a very different project from capturing the Friedmans. It was a very different project from Catfish, which is, I produced the documentary Catfish, and then I didn't direct it, but I produced it, and then I produced the 12 years worth of television shows of catfish, and all of those, especially the documentary Catfish, was done in much more of a shoestring. But this is such a different animal, and it's got to look right, and it's got to feel right, and HBO is going to get behind it in a very different way.
The Jinx is definitely epic, and thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate, again, your time, and I hope we do get together sometime in person before the next generation